I'm Helen from the Socialist Alliance. We have your article on Julian Assange on page 18 of the Green Left Weekly. You mentioned Aung San Suu Kyi, and who couldn't admire the heroic stoicism that this woman has demonstrated over the last few decades, and rejoice over the victory of the National League for Democracy in Myanmar, and hopefully the demise of the military regime there. However, I have never heard this woman mention once the hideous persecution of the Rohingya Muslims, which amounts to a genocide. I've seen pictures of kids, little children, tied to posts being flogged, a Buddhist monk standing on the body of an emaciated child. Now, presumably, she's never once mentioned these people, this persecution, and presumably she wanted to appease the Buddhist majority in Myanmar. Can you explain what appears to be the utter disdain that she seems to demonstrate towards the plight of the Rohingya Muslims?
Well, I think you've answered quite a lot of your own question there. I agree with you. I made a film on and with Aung San Suu Kyi, and I interviewed her and knew her over a period of years. I suppose I'm not altogether surprised. What she wanted, it became clear, was to lead Burma, to lead Myanmar. And she stopped being, if you like, the dissident that everyone admired, and became the politician, the hard-nosed politician. I think Suu Kyi is one of those extraordinary people who was a brilliant dissident. There have been others. Nelson Mandela was a brilliant dissident. But I don't want to group all these people, but in my experience, something happens. The principles that she fought for, that she deprived herself for, she did not extend, as you rightly say, to the Rohingya people, whose suffering has almost been the price paid for Suu Kyi to take a form of power. But you know, there's so much about Burma that is a facade. The West has wanted to bring the generals, the junta, in from the cold. They wanted to keep China. China was always their major backer. And in the present campaign against China, they want to push China back. So there are big geopolitics at work here. And Suu Kyi has been celebrated throughout the world, and especially throughout the Western world. Perhaps she was never the person, entirely the person. And I don't say this in a pejorative way necessarily. Entirely the person that we all imagine. When I talked to her, I got glimpses of this very pragmatic person. That pragmatism is of course something that's highly unacceptable. Thank you for raising it.
My name's Kate and I work as a social worker in southwest Sydney, and I'd like to ask you a question I sometimes get asked by young people, particularly young Syrian men, which is about the media and how you trust information. Because the question is, if you can't trust mainstream information, how do you know that how can you test out the information that you get? I don't really have any answer for them, and I'm wondering if you might.
Well, you don't trust the mainstream media. Yeah, you don't trust that. It's an extension. It's an extension. You can trust. Yes, there are honourable exceptions within it. But you know, in a society, this is still a society with very considerable freedom. and there is the freedom to find out. And those Syrian men really need to start their own. There's some very, very good websites that will tell them, give them a much better idea of what is happening in their own country than the warmed over anti-journalism that appears, that often sources, I see the sources, a thing called the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights. The Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, which appears as the source in American newspapers, British newspapers and Australian newspapers, is one man in a terraced house in the Midlands in England, who turns out a lot of propaganda and gives himself this grandiose name. So I only mention that as an example because he does play an utterly disproportionate role in misinforming us about Syria. With the internet, you know, anything is possible. It is a wonderful creature. There's some real rubbish on it, but there are some gems on it. And it's a matter of navigating through it and finding out. I would direct them towards it. There is on my own website a suggested list of websites that might help them get started, but that's the way.
My name is Nikki and I come from Middle East. Dear John Pilger, you have done so many wonderful work. Your amazing work about Aboriginals. Your great work regarding supporting Palestine. But you never have supported us in our struggle against a brutal regime that is killing all our freedom fighters for over 38 years. A regime that has been working with Western and Eastern imperialism, and today they have fallen officially into the arm of Western imperialism too. It is very, very painful for us to see someone like you, such a progressive, amazing character, that you have left us alone. Why? And my special thanks to Professor Rees. And my special thanks to Professor Rees for his permanent support to us. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm sorry if you think I've left you alone, and perhaps I have. Perhaps I should have written more about Iran, gone there to film, and so on. I have actually written about Iran on a number of occasions, and perhaps you've just missed it. But that's never enough. I agree with you.
I want to know if you're into the art world, John, because this Sunday the Powerhouse Museum closes down dissident objects with objects used in protests from over 200 countries around the world. The Goulburn Regional Gallery has the Salamanca Dissidents exhibition on. The Asia Pacific Art Triennial's closing, and there are the Queensland University of Technology exhibition called 65 about the 65 coup in Indonesia by one of the dissident artists is on, and none of them have had any mention anywhere in the media, and I thought you could at least put them up along with Humphrey McQueen's spiritofeureka.org, 50 years and 100 years ago, a timeline of Australia in 1966 and 1916. Put them up on your website so more people will know about the dissident artists around the world and in Australia. And my question is, do you support the Russians bombing in Syria?
Send me the list of Jefferson. Send me the list, and I'll put it up. Okay, next.
What about the Russian bombing in Syria?
No, you had your moment. I'll deal with that somewhere else.
Hi John, I am a volunteer with Vocal, Victims of Crime Assistance League. We assist people, families and children in relation to domestic violence and family law. I'm also a law student. One of the reasons why I'm working with Vocal is so that I can get practical experience, and also I'm a survivor of domestic violence. On Tuesday of this week, I was able to go down and help Senator Heffernan and a few other crossbenchers in relation to some of the issues with family law. And I'd just like to share with you my great concern is that some of these great issues that I believe for men, women and children are being ignored by the media. So I'd like to know strategies of how to deal with, how to manage that information to get it out there so that people are aware of what's happening in family court.
I would suggest you, if you haven't done already, you create your own website and you use the best of technology, the best of social media, and that's how you get it out. Don't wait around for the media.
Why is it Murdoch? Why does Murdoch stop so much information from getting out there, in your opinion?
We'd be here all night, you should know that. But, you know, that's what you should do. You seize the opportunity yourself. You create your own website, be your own gatekeeper, run your own information. It's terribly important you do that. Don't wait around for the media to do, or wring your hands about why Rupert Murdoch won't do something.
No, the issue is too that a judicial commission is trying to be put forward by Senator Hefner, but even within their own circles of the Senate, these people said information, not just media, is blocked if it's not convenient for the government.
Right, well, it doesn't work. We've discussed that. That's you're caught in a trap. You're caught in a web if you go that way. Take control of it yourself.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Kieran. I'm a fan. I'm a regular attendee here at these functions. I'll just read you my question. Kieran O'Reilly, the Brisbane-born radical Catholic peace and social justice activist and member of the Ploughshares movement, recently expressed his dissatisfaction with conventional demonstrations, which he calls, quote, a dead end really, marching up and down empty streets like a strange dance. And he goes on to say, you can't have a peace movement with a gentleman's agreement where they have a war and they say you can have your protest as long as we can have our war. And he calls for forms of direct action, and he's also expressing his disillusionment with the radical mobilisation that occurred around 2003 with the Iraqi war intervention and the failure of that to have any real effect. In fact, Bush and Blair actually argued that at the time that the demonstrations was proof of the virtues of their democracy against whatever tyranny they were fighting. So yeah,
you're right. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that puts it very eloquently. Really, you can have your demo while we have our war. But so we shouldn't just leave it to demos, should we? That are predictable. It's direct action. We shouldn't just leave it to wondering whether some ALP politician is going to bestow some kind of token support on this movement or that movement. It's about taking matters into your own hands. It means imaginative direct action. You don't get a sense of that in Australia. You're almost going to get a sense as if that war has become respectable. You know, this country's government and its arms industry support so much violence in the world. But the Australian government is going to spend, something like $200 billion on 70 odd of these Turkey aircraft I don't mean Turkish, they are flying turkeys, that is, from the United States. All of that money should be going into hospitals and schools and all the things that matter to us. So it is about imaginative direct action. And it's not just simply walking up and down and having a speech or two. It is about going to the Murdoch press. It is about a march that actually goes to the Murdoch press. It is about targeting certain politicians, certain public servants at certain times. It is about a strategy of thinking it out, not let's have another demo this Saturday. You're absolutely right. So that's where it should go.
Kieran O'Reilly also calls for intervention in terms of the war against the environment. For instance, coal mines, when they're established, people should radically intervene, perhaps to stop the coal from being transported to Abbott's Point.
Yes.
Serious.
There have been some very successful direct action on fracking. You know, the close the gate movement, and some years ago in highlighting the conditions in detention, in the detention camps. But why do these fizzle out in Australia? That's a very difficult question. It can be a harsh question, but it has to be answered. Otherwise, it's Groundhog Day, isn't it? Round and round we go.
And Kieran actually destroyed a fighter plane with his bare hands.
Yeah.
You know Kieran O'Reilly, the big guy with the dreadlocks?
Yeah.
Good evening, my name's Pauline Jensen. I was just wondering why you haven't recognised the many Greens politicians that we have.
What, sorry?
Why you haven't recognised the many Greens politicians that we have in both state parliament and federal parliament, because they work pretty tirelessly to defending the community, working towards ecological sustainability.
Do they? Okay.
Well,
when you say recognise them, I mean, you know, I don't go around opening embassies and recognise them.
When I say
what do you
recognise-
mean recognise
Well, it's just that you said that there were no politicians that were doing anything for the country. And I know personally that, especially the ones in New South Wales, they work pretty tirelessly for the community. They also, they stand up, you know, they support campaigns right through Australia, especially the coal seam gas campaign. They support as many, I mean, they're a small number compared to the Labor and Liberal, but they work really hard and they've put up with so much in Parliament. They put up with a lot of criticism and not a lot of recognition for all the really hard work that they're doing.
Sarah Hanson-Young, Jackie Parker.
Scott Ludlam.
My heart is not quite broken about them. You make it sound as if these poor politicians are working away without recognition. That's what they're meant to do. That's what they're meant to do. But you're quite right. And there are Greens who have done very good work in including defending the Indigenous families who have had children stolen from them by docs and other institutions. Yes, they have, on some issues, they have done some good work. So, in my generic criticism of politicians, I would like that to stand, but in the small print at the bottom, let's add the of exclusion, let's add the state Greens.
Thank you.
For the moment.
Hi, my name is Chandran. I am from the committee. My question relates to something you said a few years ago, something profound. In an interview with ABC, 1+1, you did say that what concerned you most was this embedding of journalists. And you said embedding, you do not mean the military sense of embedding. You said embedding of a journalist in an organization, military organization. And over a period of time, the journalist will only see what the organization wants him or her to see. And slowly his values are drained off. And you said that was gravely concerning to you. So my question to you is, has the situation worsened since you said that a few years ago? And I believe it has. And if that is the case, what can be done about it? If this embedding keeps happening, we will lose all good, enthusiastic, progressive journalists.
Well, I'm not quite sure who they are now anyway, but has it got worse? Yes, embedding. I suppose we were talking about embedding in relation to journalists being embedded with military forces, and they played a particularly significant role in the invasion of Iraq, when they beat the drums of that war, and then they reported it in terms that didn't reflect its reality. But you're quite right, and it's a very important subject. Embedding happens the moment somebody walks into an institution, unless they hold on to their whole sense of themselves, their sense of independence, their sense of the kind of journalist they want to be. Some of them may walk through the portals of the BBC or ABC here and imagine that they have become a special creature. They've risen to some nirvana of objectivity, when in fact that objectivity really is the establishment point of view. It's a discussion, it's a debate, a discussion, call it what you will, the journalists have not had. They're very defensive about this. We are very defensive about this. But it's a discussion that should happen. What is the role of a journalist within a state organisation that clearly is tied to the government in so many ways? What is the role of a journalist within the Murdoch organisation that is led by a rapacious robber baron in the United States, and whose organisation has such bigotry at so many levels? What is the role of good people? There are good people. What should they do? It's a debate that has it happened in Australia? I don't know. There are a lot of media schools in Australia. There are people calling themselves Professor of Journalism, but do they have this debate? It's the most important one of all. I've no idea. I don't think they do, actually. Or if they do, perhaps I've left them out like the mini greens. There's one or two here having a debate. I don't know. But you're absolutely right. It's absolutely crucial, because it's about public information. It's about our information and our right to information. But at the same time, we mustn't imagine that organisations that are, I would say, professionally corrupt in many ways, are going to suddenly see the light and hand down the truth. They're not. Yes. They're not, in the same way that political parties are not. And we have to confront that first and work out strategies and tactics to deal with it, and to confront it and to expose it, and create our own media, which has happened in many countries in the world. In Latin America, there's been a revolution in radio throughout the communities, barrio, poor communities, radio stations established that give people information about their own societies and their own terms. Why are we so backward? We're a privileged country.
Maybe we can copy. We are a nation of copiers.
Okay. Jim from Greenland Weekly. I had the amazing surprise of meeting John in the streets of Caracas some years ago. I was marching in a huge May Day rally, talking about never seen so many red T-shirts in your life.
I've never, it's one of those few times I've been so proud of Australia. The Australian. Down comes Jim and his
Solidarity
contingent
Brigade, yes,
on May Day, and it was such an unusual sight. A group of Australians doing something that was bold and imaginative and political and on the side of justice.
Is this a Dorothy Dix, right?
Yeah.
You two?
Well, talking of bold and good. Out of that came one of John's best films, and I think people should see it. It's called The War on Democracy, and it's about, in my opinion, actually in some ways the most important thing that's happening in the world today, and that is the US and the rest of the colonial world's attack on the progressive governments in Latin America. We don't have a lot of progressive governments in the world. We have got to defend them. The question of solidarity with the progressive movements and governments in Latin America is numero uno, in my opinion. We have a disaster in the Middle East. We've got movements in Europe, we've got movements in different parts of the world. In Latin America we have progressive governments, and those governments are under absolute attack day and night from the United States, from the from the capitalist class and from the domestic oligarchy. We must realise that it is a critical question for the world to defend those governments and defend those popular movements in Latin America, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, and even in lesser, more argumentable case like Argentina, Brazil.
We started talking about Julian Assange. Which government gave Julian Assange political refuge? The tiny government of Ecuador. Which government? Which is the only government, I may be corrected on this, but I'm pretty sure it's the only government to have told the Americans to take their military base out of their country. But they didn't put it that way. The Ecuadorian government didn't put it that way. They said, you can have a military base in Ecuador as long as we can have, Ecuador, a military base in Florida. And this was said by the president. What wonderful humour, what wonderful wit, the kind of thing that you never hear about in the sort of real humour that you never hear in Canberra. But he said it to them. You can keep your military base. We have an army, pretty small, but we'll have a base in Florida. They threw them out. And, what has happened in the last, I suppose, since the Reagan-Thatcher era has been the rollback of the very precarious gains, the gains that happened here in the mid-70s, the gains that have happened in Latin America since they're freed from the fascist dictatorships, many of them, from Venezuela right through to Chile. No, they all can't be called progressive governments, but there are very, very imaginative and inspiring elements within these governments. And as you rightly say, Jim, these are under attack. Now, isn't it interesting? In Australia, we know so little about them, but what we do know is down to people like those at Green Left and people like Jim who have gone there, but we know so little about them. Had we known something about them, we would be inspired. Because what happened in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez was inspiring. It was imperfect, it was messy, but it was inspiring. What happened in Bolivia? The only indigenous government the only indigenous country to produce an indigenous government in a parliament that used to ban indigenous people not all that long ago. This extraordinary government in Bolivia has been able to navigate its way through the shark-infested waters of geopolitics and survive. But all these governments, now in Argentina, there were some modest but important gains there. The rollback has begun there. It's a part of the world that I read the other day, there is actually a study of ignorance called anthology. We have to be students of this ignorance. We are ignorant of Latin America, but had we known about it, then it may have inspired us to do something in this country.
I've just come back from Argentina, Chile and Cuba. David Bobby's my name. Hadn't been to Chile, for 30 years since I made Chile hasta cuando. I had the privilege of sitting in the museum that Michelle Bachelet, who was tortured under Pinochet's dictatorship and fled to Australia with her parents in the 1970s, and then returned to Chile to become the president. And I had the privilege of sitting in the audience when I showed Chile hasta cuando, and 14-year-old Manuel Guerrero, who some of you that saw Chile hasta cuando 30 years ago in Australia when we showed it here, he came to the screen as well. And I think it's a nice moment to almost finish the night on, to remind you that when he got up to the stage, 2 hours after his father had been discovered in a in a creek bed in the outskirts of Santiago with his throat cut as a member of the Communist Party, with the 3 members of the Communist Party. He got up and said at 40 years of age, quoted Bertolt Brecht, and he said, there are those that struggle for 1 year and they are good. There are those that struggle for 2 years and they are better. And those that struggle all their lives. And my father belonged to that group of people. And it doesn't matter whether you struggle with a cross, with a stick of bread, or with a sickle and a hammer in our hand, but we must continue to struggle. And I think that's the take-home message from tonight, with what John has imbued with us, with what he said, in keeping the torch alight and keeping us inspired to keep on struggling, despite how evil, despite how greedy, despite how dark it is out there. We have to keep the torch alive, we have to keep on struggling and keep the light alive.
Thank you.
My question is, what are your thoughts of Paul Keating's standing in the Labor Party, particularly his view or campaign that this country will never be a great country until we reconcile with the Indigenous population fully through a treaty, through changing the constitution, whatever it takes. So what are your thoughts on that?
I don't recall Paul Keating saying recently that he was for a treaty.
Maybe not a treaty, but a reconciliation with the Indigenous people.
Well, I think
fully reconcile. You'll never be
Paul Keating did almost nothing for Indigenous people when he was Prime Minister, and I wouldn't regard him as a source of encouragement to people virtually at any level. Paul Keating and Bob Hawke together were responsible for the greatest shift of income from the bottom to the top in this country. Paul Keating's various token moves towards, I suppose, his own place in history as far as Indigenous people are concerned have never really impressed me, I'm sorry. So I don't remember Paul Keating talking about a treaty. If, as a former Prime Minister, he stood up and said, I'm for a treaty, let's have a treaty, then that would be a very important step. But instead, last week, all over the front of the Sydney Morning Herald, there was some utterly incomprehensible speech he made about whether we should have GST or not. So that's Paul Keating's vision. It's pretty small. As you can see, I don't really have it. I'm sure there is the Minnie Green factor here. There must be something in Paul Keating's repertoire that deserves acknowledgement, but I can't think of it.
My name is Lindsay Pearson. I just wanted to ask you something about WikiLeaks. So thanks for being such a strong supporter of both Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. I think Julian particularly needs strong voices like yours in the public eye now. But yeah, I also think that sometimes the Julian Assange story is in danger of eclipsing the actual material which WikiLeaks has released. So I just wondered, as an investigative journalist, how that material has helped you, and maybe what you think are the most significant releases, and maybe what you think is the significance of the organisation in general.
I think that the Julian Assange story is only in danger of eclipsing WikiLeaks, and I don't think it is, because of that he has been so attacked, and he has been attacked because of WikiLeaks, and that's. I think WikiLeaks is probably the most significant. The arrival of WikiLeaks is probably the most significant development in the dissemination of free information and of journalism that I can remember. And that's why he got into trouble. That's why Julian Assange got into trouble. That's why he excited so much jealousy among those paid to set the record straight, i.e. journalists, who haven't been doing that. WikiLeaks, to use the language of journalism, produced more scoops in a few months than all of them did in a lifetime. He told, WikiLeaks told us, or began to tell us, how our government lies to us in private, how it takes us to wars based on lies, and much more. I mean, I think what's interesting, if you look at the whole landscape of WikiLeaks' disclosures, and the genius of WikiLeaks is the way they've targeted each country. So, in Northern Ireland, for example, there have been some extraordinary revelations of what has happened in recent years in that country. Over Iraq, WikiLeaks disclosed that the US government, in fact the West, had begun its campaign to get rid of Assad well before the so-called Arab Spring. So I suppose I can't really pay greater tribute to an organisation. I'd like to pay tribute at the same time to Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning is serving 35 years for being an incredibly courageous truth teller. And they tried their best to get Chelsea to implicate Julian Assange, and actually failed. They said that at Chelsea's trial. We've tried and we failed because Chelsea wouldn't play their game. So, you know, there's some amazing human beings that have cropped up in our sights in recent years, haven't there? And those two are two of them.
I recently read a book called The Paradox of Liberation, which explores the idea that freedom-inspired revolutions. Okay, mate. Freedom-inspired revolutions are often countered by religious fundamentalists and nationalists. So I think a pretty good example of that is Algeria from the 60s through to now, essentially. So originally a fairly good revolution, which turned into religious extremism, unfortunately. I understand, you're going to have to forgive me if I'm wrong here, but I think you've been quite an advocate for removing our troops from the Middle East.
For what?
From removing forces from the Middle East.
No.
Okay.
Oh, removing which troops?
Australian troops.
Oh, Australian troops, oh yeah.
So, I'm going to keep going. I believe such a big hole has kind of been dug here that I don't see another way out of fighting ISIS to some degree. I mean, this probably isn't going to be a very popular view, but I think it's realistic to some degree. I don't see any other way of sort of coming to an agreement with these people unless there's going to have to be a war fought with these people, with ISIS, because these people aren't bringing anything to the negotiation table. I'd just like to get your thoughts on that.
Who funds them? Okay, well, I think, let me just make one general observation, and I think this is, overall your thesis is that it's about time that we ended terrorism. Well, the way to end terrorism is to stop being terrorists.
Yeah.
The Western state terrorism is the main source of terrorism in the world. The victims of terrorism, the greatest number of victims of terrorism are Muslim people. Those two facts need to be almost scratched on the bathroom mirrors of anybody with a public voice, because they're truths. The other point I wish to make is that, unfortunately, because there is really no free information available in the mainstream in Australia, you haven't heard that ISIS is on the verge of defeat. The corridor to Turkey has been closed. The Syrian army has effectively defeated ISIS, backed by the Russians, backed by Hezbollah, backed by Iran. Whatever Australia does there is beside the point. So I would think, as far as Syria is concerned, and this is not as far as Iraq is concerned, but as far as Syria is concerned, I think ISIS, I dare to make a prediction, I think ISIS will be defeated and that defeat is happening now.
It seems as though it keeps appearing a power vacuum that just, ISIS are filling that. Yeah. But it was created after a previous withdrawal. I mean, I think there's a lot more to the story than just defeating terrorism.
ISIS was created. ISIS is not much different from the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and the Al Qaeda in Iraq. The various tribal groups who had affiliations to Al Qaeda and others in Libya and in Syria. All these places are places where we, quote unquote, have destroyed societies. There was no jihadism in Iraq when I drove the length of Iraq shortly before the invasion. None. And I felt perfectly safe. There was no jihadism in Libya when it was controlled and run quite successfully by the dictator Gaddafi. There was no jihadism in Syria before it was imported in the guise of a rebellion in Syria. So I think the most important thing is we do have to look in that bathroom mirror, in that mirror. We talk about them constantly. We have to talk about us.
Okay. The last question.
George from Late Night Radio, ABC.
Sorry, I've got my own publicity machine. Thanks, John, for always your provocative opinions, so welcome. I just wanted to ask you, personally, I think we're on the cusp of the greatest catastrophic economic collapse since the Great Recession, and there's signs of it just in the last few weeks with the German banks revealing a lot of problems that they've been trying to keep hidden. And I had the pleasure to go to a talk by Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek finance minister at Sydney University. A few people might have been here. It's probably on the Sydney University YouTube channel. I'd recommend it to anybody. If a tenth of what he said is actual, then we're really in trouble. But my question regards, if this happens, and the best we can hope for is that we'll have maybe no growth for the next 10, 20 years, and the worst, it will be apocalypse. The resultant thing I'm worried about is the political volatility and the ramifications for personal liberty and security. The Utah data facility in America, which is the biggest that's ever been created, is in abeyance because of libertarian elements of the Republican Party, but I don't think that will last, particularly in that situation that I'm talking about. So I just wanted to get your opinion on what you think might happen if things get as bad as we think, in terms of what governments will then impose on people in terms of withdrawal of personal liberties.
Well, I think it's already happened, hasn't it? I mean, the personal liberties are being withdrawn over and again. You have a surveillance state now, surveillance states in Australia, in Europe, in the United States. In the United States, there's a war on African American people. Civil liberties have been withdrawn. In Australia, a journalist, even if they wanted to be critical of the so-called security services, if they did so, they would find themselves very likely to go to prison. So there are many of these. All of them are unnecessary, all these laws. There are plenty of laws that look after the security of the state. Whether it's a choice between, as you put it, no growth and the apocalypse, I don't know. But usually the apocalypse is not visited on us in wealthy societies. It spills into those societies that depend on a single commodity or a single resource, like a fossil fuel, or simply impoverished societies. They get more and more impoverished. But I'm not a futurist. I know about what you're saying about the German banks, and I think it's the fraud
of what really happened in 2008 when banks behaved in a criminal manner. These were criminal banks, these were criminal organisations.
And nobody went to jail.
From Goldman Sachs right through to those, to Royal Bank of Scotland and the rest of them had collapsed. And for a brief moment there, we had a public conversation in Europe, here, the United States, about banks. Banks were bad. But then, almost overnight, that disappeared. And we were to blame. And a word called austerity came in. And people had to go along with policies of austerity. That's fraudulent. The whole thing is fraudulent. Austerity is unnecessary. The banks are still criminal enterprises. That's what used to be called capitalism. It's a version of the same thing.
It now remains for me to, on your behalf, to thank John for what he's been doing for almost 80 years. I don't want to insult you, John. And thank you for being part of Politics in the Park.